Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks to the distinguished female voices who somehow brought a truly elegant atmosphere to this autumn evening, with a hint maybe of Junism. Diana Ursu. Thank you on behalf of Marie Lecert's publishing house for such a distinguished presence. Thank you, Maria Iftime, representing the Mihai Eminescu Institute for Conservative Political Studies. Thanks to the esteemed speakers, Mr. Florian Banu and, of course, Professor Petriș Orpeiu for their insightful thoughts. But most of all, thank you for coming to Casa Poporului, which is first and foremost your house. And you didn't come here just for a stroll or a passing experience. You came to participate, I believe, in a dialogue. And there will indeed be such a moment. An essential dialogue, I'd say, about the destiny of Europe. I humbly try, though it's always difficult for me, to express that any self-respecting intellectual, especially during the last 100 years, has attempted, when facing tragedy, to respond with authenticity. I remember my days as a theology student in London, where I would read passages aloud from Karl Barth's Epistle to the Romans, often during various social gatherings, reflecting deeply on those profound insights. The most important writing of the New Testament, which starts from this observation about the fallen nature of man. Karl Barth reads Dostoevsky, but mostly reads the Frontline Chronicles from World War I, and is absolutely horrified. 10 million people died, and he asks himself, why is man a wolf to man? Hobbes' old question. Then we have Junger, who makes the same kind of commentary. Ernest Junger refers twice to these world conflagrations, but I think his most beautiful and his profoundly insightful work, The Parisian Journal, poses a deep question to us who see ourselves as free and emancipated in this modern age. Part of progress. We consider ourselves, of course, more intelligent than other civilizations and cultures. It's us Europeans above all who are questioned, Jungers, Barth, and others alike, with this question: why have we come to trivialize evil? A question later revisited by Hannah Arendt. You also have George Orwell praising Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War. There are plenty of touchstones, deep reflections from serious intellectuals in extremely tough times. And let's not forget Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations right on the northern Italian front fighting the Germanic tribes. So, talking about war and peace is absolutely essential, whether you like Tolstoy or not. Reflecting on the human condition amid unleashed violence and obscenity, I have to say, right? Pornographic, yes. Of physical violence. Expressed between the fighting troops. In these circumstances, I believe we are all called to pause, to suspend our psychological reactions and truly reflect on the human condition. And probably I'm still naive enough to believe that man was not made for this inner tearing apart. I remain convinced by the biblical narrative in the book of Genesis, which tells us that, if you will, the rhetoric of peace has both a protological and eschatological dimension. We were made for something else. We were made for the Sabbath. We were made for the great rest. We were made to love one another. We were made to tolerate one another. We were made to find rest in each other. A friend is one who gives you rest. And I've lost many friends, ironically, thinking about this war. This is because the recent trend of ideological conditioning among intellectuals and politicians deserves special attention and careful consideration. Some observers, when looking at a war and paraphrasing a clever Latin phrase, say, I came, I saw, and I subcontracted. That's certainly one cynical way to approach it. Whether you represent the Rand Corporation, BlackRock, or another powerful entity, you can cynically view a war through the lens of its profits and financial gains, detaching yourself emotionally from the human cost involved. And officially, the numbers I have are from both the White House and the European Commission. So far, the West has invested nearly $400 billion, almost $500 billion, into supporting the Ukraine project, which is a massive and unprecedented effort internationally. With all the ethical justifications we can understand, of course, I also talk about Russia as an aggressor state. But we are no longer in 2022, not 2014 either. Not even 1991, when the foreign ministry here in Bucharest was communicating to Kiev that certain borders needed to be discussed, as daring as Romania's leaders were back then. Well, we're no longer there. We're at a different point. And speaking of what Mr. Florian Banu said, yes, the Russians play chess, the Chinese play Go, and the Americans play poker. That alone is a source of concern for all of us. Sure, I wrote a book, spent the whole summer on it. I used to read the slogan of a major publisher: as many books read, as many lives lived. By the way, and as Maria mentioned, Eftimie, I think there's a flip side to this as well. For every book written, there's a vacation lost or wasted. My wife wasn't too happy that instead of relaxing on the Black Sea coast or some other shore with other folks, I locked myself away every day and spent July and August consuming heaps of literature that had to be reinterpreted and reshaped. I have some key theses to defend, and I want to be very clear. First off, I fully assume a pacifist stance. I'm no fool. There's an ancient theology of defensive war. Augustine of Hippo penned important pages on it. But I genuinely believe man isn't made for killing. Man is made to be in communion with his neighbor. And no clear-headed figure today who justifies war escalation. The war can't go without challenge from us. The rest of us who believe that, one way or another, the radical gospel challenges us every day. My peace I give to you. Peace to all. The liturgy is full of references to the experience of peace. Hesychasm, spoken about by the fathers of Mount Athos, from Gregory Palamas to Elder Joseph, expresses this ideal. Every moment we're invited into an experience of peace. Apatheia is a virtue praised by Evagrius Ponticus. So, as a Christian, you can't say war is worth continuing no matter what, unless you think schizophrenia is a possibility. If being the defender of death and endless war is a blatant violation of the Christian creed, then we must go deeper and ask ourselves some anthropological, philosophical, and ethical questions. For instance, the question about the dynamics between great powers. Whether a mimetic rivalry between Cain and Abel replays in tensions like those between the US and the Russian Federation. As someone who wrote a book on the Trump phenomenon and predicted Trump's victory when no one gave me credit in 2016, I was alone on a TV set while 14 experts explained why Donald Trump could never win. As a defender of the peace message that Donald Trump put forward from the start, he was really into the history of world wars and even wrote in the 70s. Maybe even 60, maybe even more against the Vietnam War. I stand before you and say that America is going through today. It's more like a brief moment, or better, moving through times of intense questioning after the disaster, caused in the last 30 years by the foreign policy of neoconservatives and neoliberals. This is the moment we find ourselves in. It's a moment of questioning for American society, which propelled Donald Trump with a message of peace. While Americans want to promote peace, here in Europe, we want to promote war. What a paradox! What a counter-rhythm! What a historical lag! Why do Americans want to stop permanent wars? Because they're fed up with losing and seeing their money wasted. Now, conflicts arise in places never meant to be involved, with serious consequences unfolding fast. The part of a geopolitical area claimed, let's say legitimately by the Monroe Doctrine, even 200 or 150 years ago. If the Founding Fathers saw Victoria Nuland's speech from 2013 or 2014, if Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, George Washington, or Alexander Hamilton had read Miss Nuland's speech around Euromaidan, they'd be horrified. All these deists, who didn't necessarily support a Trinitarian theology, would be shocked to see American officials advocating, for example, NATO troops in Donbass. Where exactly is America? And where is Pokrovsk? And where do Alaska and Slaviansk truly stand on the map? The fact that we have gradually started accepting this kind of expansionist rhetoric, the so-called export of democracy at any cost, reveals, in my humble opinion, a small but significant cultural and geopolitical minority. It's a worrying trend that deserves our critical attention. In other words, Americans have more courage to tell their officials the truth than we do. The ones who are direct victims of experiments, we know how they ended. $2.3 trillion spent in Afghanistan. Over 1 million dead in Iraq. It's not me saying this. It's Brown University, an American institution. After so many failures, the last probably being Ukraine, Americans said, "We want a new leader. We want Donald Trump. We want the man who brings peace. We want a realistic discourse, like the one by J.D. Vance." Who is J.D. Vance? He's the intellectual who once in the White House tells us what we all know. Ex nihilo nihil. Nothing comes from nothing, except of course God's creation. Looking at this conflict, J.D. Vance says, the Ukraine conflict, we easily see warnings from America's great thinkers like George Kennan, one of the last century's top diplomats, Princeton professor, and former ambassador to Moscow. Warnings published, for example, by the New York Times in 1997, which said, NATO's expansion to Kyiv, especially towards Kiev. That would be a fatal mistake for sure. There's really no need to translate that phrase. Several prominent American thinkers, including Henry Kissinger, have warned us. Unfettered NATO expansion in the transatlantic region could spark a massive, catastrophic war. Remember, in life and history, nothing truly comes from nothing. Russia was weak and dominated for decades, and that actually helped us, the Romanians, as we managed to join NATO and the EU relatively peacefully, without problems with neighbors. But Russia of 30 years ago is no longer weak. Russia now has not only a capable army, experts agree, no need to elaborate. Russia, and here I refer to the book I encourage you to read carefully, has an ideology. When I was a philosophy student in Cluj, I was reading all kinds of postmodern authors. Some, like Jean-François Lyotard, announced the death of meta-narratives. Others, like Gianni Vattimo, spoke of weak thought. Weak thought avoids relying on rigid categories. The nation is a powerful idea. So is God. Historical destiny and civilization are powerful ideas too. Anyone using these concepts in identity debates is always pushing a certain story. Brutal. And the narrative I've investigated, trying to understand what's on Dugin's mind, what Gumilev thinks, and what was behind other. Eurasian thinkers propose a narrative that might be false, maybe spiritually, ethically, or historically. But this narrative is directly opposed to another significant story. The liberal globalist narrative claims democracy should be exported worldwide, ignoring history and culture. They see democracy as universal, but this simplifies complex realities. I critique this because imposing models without understanding local traditions often causes conflict. We must consider each society's unique background before deciding if democracy fits. It's not one size fits all, and rushing to export it can do more harm than good. Specifically, if we want to conduct democratic experiments in Kabul, is it worth spending $2.3 billion for that? If we want to export Jefferson's democracy to Kiev, is a war justified? This is the usual rhetoric from neoconservatives and neoliberals in Washington, still heard today. When you look on the ground, you realize none of what they say holds up. I took the time to study what Ukrainian society looked like 100 years ago. I know Romania's roots, or at least I think I do. Romania comes from a democratic culture. The parliament was established here in Bucharest 150 years ago. We had a king like Carol, who brought a Western vision. After 90, we made no grand efforts to rediscover that parliamentary tradition. Someone told me I'm too harsh on George Soros, that the journalist who said that learned democracy from Soros. I said I learned it from Ion Rațiu. And from Corneliu Coposu. I believe there's a difference. So, in the 90s, we had a liberal democratic tradition to claim as our own. I checked what traditions the Ukrainians had. Honestly, I looked beyond the romantic 19th century narratives. What significant historical figures do Ukrainians invoke today when it comes to the symbolism of their actions and their struggle for identity? Hostile on one hand, yet institutional on the other. I found this strange figure, Stepan Bandera, born in 1909, if I'm not mistaken, in Lviv, from a Greek Catholic priest family, driven by a deep belief in Ukraine's unique destiny. Bandera's image is still used today by leaders like Zelensky or Zaluzhny. Zelensky began as a liberal cosmopolitan, but later shifted into a nationalist autocrat. Bandera believed in everything that he did. Benito Mussolini. This Bandera believed everything Shaul Morar believed, and was also deeply influenced by Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. He even accepted much of Adolf Hitler's ideology. Then in September 1941, Wehrmacht troops entered Kiev. It was actually easier for the Germans to take Kiev compared to the heavy resistance they encountered in Leningrad. Notably in Leningrad, Putin's parents were actively trying to resist the German army. On the other hand, in Kiev, many people, including Bandera's friends, welcomed the arrival of the German troops with open arms. This was quite an intriguing and complex moment in history. During that same month, Bandera got involved in operations aimed at eliminating Polish and Jewish populations in the Volhynia region. He was clearly connected with pogroms and hateful acts. After the Second World War, his legacy remained highly controversial and continued to evoke strong reactions across Europe and beyond. He is mostly popularized among the anti-communist Ukrainian diaspora, only to later be claimed by the Euromaidan activists. I found it very strange, to have a figure like Bandera tolerated in Kiev as the founding symbol of Galician nationalism, inspired by Dmitry Dontsov's writings, about whom very few of us know much. Meanwhile, in Bucharest, there was a policy of systematically erasing all references to Mircea Eliade, Octavian Goga, or any interwar figure who had some flaws. In other words, I noticed a double standard. Westerners were extremely vigilant about any nationalist slippage in post-communist Romania, but very lenient towards any fiery Galician nationalist rhetoric. I went further and found that Ukraine, just as Huntington said, was born from a fault line. There were two worlds. The Western world of Ukraine looking towards the European institutions and the eastern world of Donbass today, with its clear and distinct influences. Ties and connections with Moscow, some justified on religious grounds. I'll give you an example. When I was, again, young, I had groups of friends who organized pilgrimages, and at one point, I was invited, though I never went myself, to Lavra Pecherskaya, following in the footsteps of Petru Movila, who, if I'm not mistaken, was born in Suceava, a true Bukovinian, and who became the abbot of this monastery dating back to 1080, considered a kind of Studion of Ukraine, viewed as an Eastern Jerusalem, housing over 1,000 monks. This monastery, Lavra Pecherskaya. Starting in 1640, a lasting spiritual link connected Andrei Rublev's Moscow to Lavra Pecherskaya. Putin wasn't around then. That's centuries later. Because of this deep connection to Orthodox roots, Zelensky made the controversial move to cut all ties between the monks at Lavra Pecherskaya and the church, ending a union of over 400 years. This made me think about the dilemmas of Western liberalism, the same liberalism reflected in the US Constitution, which calls for separation between church and state. Church and state. On one hand, we say we want a separation between church and state. But on the other, we turn a blind eye to the harshest intrusion of the state into the intimate conscience of some believers who might be Russian-speaking or not, but want to maintain a relationship with a spiritual center they've valued for at least 400 years. The memory of Petru Movila, bishop of both Galicia and Little Russia, as it was called then, is trampled on today. Romanian authorities don't react at all. Beyond what Professor Petrișor Peiu and researcher Dr. Florian Banu have said, I want to add a few words about the myths this book tries to shatter. Zelensky is not Churchill. In their thirst for relevance, many intellectuals today offer false. You'll often hear these kinds of equivalences being made. For example, Ilie Boloyan is constantly compared to Iuliu Maniu. I've personally heard that more than once. Similarly, Volodymyr Zelensky is frequently likened to Winston Churchill. But if you don't react to these kinds of absurd and misleading comparisons, you're just allowing a dangerous form of historical ignorance to deepen and spread even more. But I say this false equivalence must be challenged from a few very simple perspectives. Churchill, although he lost the empire because fighting the German Wehrmacht cost him dearly. He agreed to elections, knowing he couldn't win. Churchill, during the war, never banned criticism against him. Churchill didn't interfere with the Methodist or Calvinist churches, who traced their roots to German traditions. He never imposed harsh measures or intervened brutally in those communities during the war. Within the ecclesiastical community space, Churchill stayed more of a classic liberal, letting people voice their opinions, even criticism of state authority, during those 5 or 6 years of war. And criticism wasn't lacking, especially after the disaster known as Dresden in 1945. Churchill faced especially harsh judgment post-Yalta. Another calamity for us. He was criticized then and still is today, rightly so, in ways Zelensky isn't, because any critique of Zelensky is seen as siding with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's authoritarianism. In this book, I treat Zelensky as a hero, without denying the bravery of the Ukrainian army or the country's right to self-defense, especially in the early months and years of the war. Admirable in a way. But after 4 years, you have the right to ask questions. Was it worth it? Was Zelensky's leadership wise or not? You have every right to wonder what the political and military leaders of the Romanian lands did in similar situations. Sure, the comparison might seem a bit stretched, but it's quite enlightening. Take Vlad the Impaler, for example. When overwhelmed by Ottoman power, he negotiated skillfully, securing the right to mint coins and even to impose a Romanian succession to the throne. Stephen the Great followed a similar path. Romanian history offers us political models suggesting that after military confrontations, even after significant battles like Vaslui, you can still open the door to negotiation. Mehmed II recognized Stephen's strength and proposed further negotiations after 1475. So, today, if you were to speak about negotiating, you'd obviously be labeled a Putin supporter. Corruption and intolerance in the Kiev regime represent another complex chapter in this long, troubled book. And I want to stress very clearly here, ladies and gentlemen, that criticizing a regime or a government doesn't mean despising a people. My deepest respect, once again, goes out to ordinary Ukrainians. But the deaths of Denis Kireev, the isolation of Oleksiy Arestovich, who turned into a dissident and had to flee to Miami to save his life, the persecution of professors like Marta Havrisko, and even the suspicious death of Gonzalo Lira, all give us pause. Criticizing Vladimir Putin's tyranny, an exercise that's both legitimate and necessary, especially starting from Alex Navalny's death, doesn't mean we should turn a blind eye to these excesses. Now I can hear you asking, so what constructive solution do you propose, Mr. Neamțu? You've slammed globalist liberalism and Moscow's Eurasianism. You say neither works well. So what exactly should we do? Humbly, I say that apart from embracing a realist geopolitical vision, John Mearsheimer's tragic realism, I'm not claiming originality, nor is it always necessary to be original. I end with a proposal. It's a moderate proposal, a suggestion. A decent proposal. It's about rediscovering the healthy roots of Romanian conservatism, of national conservatism. If Americans have J.D. Vance, a brilliant representative of this tradition, and the Russians have Solzhenitsyn, I repeat, a luminous figure of national conservatism we can look to without much fear, then I believe Romanians too have a duty in the coming decades to revive this tradition. That's why I invited you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm truly glad to see so many well-prepared people here today for such a debate. To revive this institution of gatherings, not university-based but with a civic dimension, the institution of round tables, which sparked the '89 miracle in so many neighboring countries. I invited you to look with more optimism at this possibility. To relaunch a think tank, a conservative political studies institute named Mihai Eminescu, since he remains the guiding figure of Romanian conservatism. Eminescu criticized not only the Russian aggression but also the brazen behavior of the troops who forgot why they came to the Balkans. They came to defeat the Ottoman Empire, which they managed especially at Plevna. The Grand Duke was absolutely incredible in the courage and boldness with which he faced the Ottoman troops in 1877-78. The Russians fought alongside the Romanians against the Ottomans, but Eminescu criticized them because we certainly lost southern Bessarabia, and because they caused a lot of trouble on their way home. Yet equally Eminescu condemned blind imitation and, of course, the theory of forms copied without any substance, Sciarrosetti's theory, which Maiorescu also obliterated with a Condei, we sorely lack today. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, ultimately, debate about the future of Romanian conservatism. The book I wrote is such an invitation to meditate on the tragedy of a country. Ukraine is the country living today through an immense tragedy. It's also an invitation to a deeper reflection on the ideologies behind these tectonic forces that shift and cause earthquakes every day. It's also an invitation to a near-cynical desentimentalization of the discourse on the great powers. When it comes to alliances, you have to read them, I'd say, almost cynically, and wonder what you really get from alliances, say with the United States, the European Union, or NATO. And after we move past this phase of by avoiding over-psychologizing and misplaced sentimentality, we can position ourselves within a framework, a constructive framework. This is the role I take on. And because I have this position is temporary at the Institute for Conservative Political Studies, designed specifically to create a fertile and welcoming space for creativity and dialogue. I truly encourage each and every one of you to actively join this effort and participate. Thank you all very much for being here today.